all of that to be just better and more inclusive.
So I suppose my question was kind of how can we make it more inclusive if every project that is built in order to make it economically viable, the affordable housing has to be
well, there needs to be a business model behind it that makes it that way, and then the policies that back that business model as well. I mean, there was an interesting example in Hong Kong of a shopping mall called Housing Place, where they wanted to get people to shop higher and higher, and so the quantity surveyors, not the designers really enough, they came up with this idea of the super escalator, and so they've created atria and gardens on the upper levels, and then they've made the whole shop vertical rather than horizontal like a shopping mall usually. Obviously that's a shopping mall, so it's a single-use thing, but I think creative business solutions that come with a design solution could be a key to that.
Yeah.
It's changing the typology rather than being like, oh yeah, they're exclusive, let's not do them. Really. And then back to your question about mid-rise building, again, it's so generic, it's so difficult to answer.
Yeah.
I mean, is mid-rise right? Well, for what? For where?
Places, yeah.
For offices, for residential, for mixed use, in central areas, in this district, in this other district.
So I think the idea is that it is contextual, but by kind of admitting that, I feel, might leave a bit too much flexibility in policy. And that's where I think people end up getting around policies and justifying developments that might not be livable and might not be inclusive. I mean, it goes back to your point about governance. You have to get good governance, but is it not also about maybe local participation and kind of co-plan and co-design?
And also admitting that policies are not everything, regulations are not everything. You always need human beings to be there to say, either from the community or from the local authority, to look at the design, to experience it, to look critically at it, just not ticking boxes and saying, yeah, it's the bill, it's the bill, it's the bill. It's more than just ticking boxes, it's about it.
But when it comes to policy influences, I don't think policies relating to design ever work particularly successfully. But policies might be able to influence urban capacity, and I think that's particularly important. The clustering of tall buildings around transport interchanges is generally accepted as being a coherent approach to structuring the density of development around the city, and I don't disagree with that. You know, that was a major justification for building the London Bridge Tower where it is. The current cluster of tall buildings around Blackfriars Road is less difficult to justify on those grounds. But my concern is that unless you have an understanding of the broader implications of development capacity, which is not just access, it's important. It's not the only thing. It's the servicing of it. It's how the agriculture and farming around a large city can serve that concentration of population. My concern is that there is insufficient control over the amount of tall buildings that are being built. Sao Paulo is a terrible example. I think that if planning policies are going to do anything, it's a matter of we can avoid the overheating of density and of the consequent impact on land values, which are causing the overheating of cities like London, and that may get worse. I mean, the difficulties that we've gone through over the last 10 years seem to have done very little to slow the exponential growth in property values and the interest in building and building high. We seem to be moving towards a singularity, and that could be disastrous. In fact, almost certainly would be disastrous unless we exercise some self-control.
Okay, so I have one more question, and then I'd really like to throw it out to the floor. But just picking up on this idea that building tall frees up space on the ground and in cities, it may free up certain space for the existing city, but then you're also adding a lot more people by building a lot more housing, let's say. And so it puts more pressure on space as well as facilities. I've worked in projects before where people have said, okay, so you're going to put 8,000 flats and no doctor surgery and no school. How is that going to work? How are we going to kind of survive? So can we strike a balance so that housing is kind of aligned with the level of amenities without growing out, as you say, in terms of expanding the city?
Just as a first thought to that, the high-rise accommodates mixed uses very, very well. And as Michael was referring to, the Vancouverism model of having a podium with your stacks on top, you can integrate uses very, very efficiently. So as you say, you could have 8,000 flats be put into an area, but that's not to say that you can't associate that with also putting in all of the requirements that need to go with those to deliver those outcomes of living.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Well, I would say that it does add a lot of pressure on space, because what you're doing is you're creating private space within the tall building and its podium. So you're creating a lot of private amenity, but you're not leaving a lot of public space usually, or you have to buy it. Basically, you get more height to provide your public space on your podium. That's what usually happens. And so you do create a lot of pressure. I mean, we experienced that in Hong Kong, the way that's gone back, because the quality of life suffers from it. You end up with overcrowding very easily. And yes, it's a very sustainable mode of living because you're close to transport and you're close to work. Basically, you live where you work. Is that really what everyone wants? That's a different question.
Yeah.
How do you go about resolving that, however, is probably by having a better understanding of capacity overall and where you do want intensity and a kind of 24/7 activation of space, and where you do want to have more space for breathing and more quiet, and having that as a strategy.
Yeah. Okay, definitely time to hear from everyone else.
Can I just ask
Oh, sorry.
something?
Yes, absolutely.
This could be relatively controversial if we can draw the debate away from London and think about some of the bigger cities in the UK.
Yes.
I actually think there are quite strong arguments for tall buildings in the bigger cities. Certainly in places like Manchester, Birmingham, for example, skyscrapers have been built, the land values have stacked up before the last recession. Those cities have used skyscrapers not only as kind of points of tourism, but actually as kind of economic drivers to attract business investment, to say to the world, look, we're exciting, dynamic places. And I don't think we should forget that. There are obviously concerns in places like Liverpool, where, for those of you who know, there's a scheme called Liverpool Waters. I think the largest planning application ever dealt with in the UK. Was approved without being called in by the Secretary of State to create the so-called Shanghai on the Mersey. And I think there are questions there about the impact on character of places like Liverpool, one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. But actually, I don't think we should forget that skyscrapers can be very positive. Maybe not in London, it may be that London's reached its peak in terms of skyscrapers, or should reach its peak. But certainly there is benefit to thinking about skyscrapers in certain locations outside.
That's a great point. Yeah. Okay, so we've got a mic here. We don't have to use it. I'll put it on here. No, I can't. Who would like to? Okay, sorry. Yes, just shout your question if that's okay.
Yeah, I was going to refer to Stephen's point about vertical movements, sterile and single purpose. To me, skyscrapers are very detached from the people that are inside, because for security reasons you cannot open the window, you don't receive the city that is around you, the seasons, like everything that is normal life, and I think it's very isolating, and on the other hand it would be very important for a sense of place and notion of your environment and comfort to have that. So the question would be, what are the strategies to reintroduce this healthy and natural connection to your environment?
Okay. Did everyone get that? Okay, great.
I think I might go back to Vancouver again to answer my question. Sorry.
Are we all going to move to
I'm
Vancouver?
not sure I'm going to field trip immediately.
Beware of the overcrowding.
Yeah, I think there's. I don't want to overvalorize Vancouver because it has issues with some of its tall building design. But I think there's two things we might learn from that. One is this idea of the internal balcony, where actually windows open vertically rather than horizontally. And that seems to be a solution that Vancouver has implemented across the board in the central city. The other thing is that they have, it strikes me that in the UK, most planners, in fact the vast majority of planners, have a very, inadequate design training. So actually when you look at kind of the detail of committee reports about the assessment of the design of a particular building, not just skyscrapers, often that understanding is relatively lacking. And in Vancouver they have, really interestingly, I scribbled down the name and I completely forgot it. Higher Buildings Advisory Panel, which is a really interesting kind of mechanism. It's independent, and this might feed a debate about whether there should be a commissioning body, which meets independently of the City Council, is chaired by a person of repute, Ken Yang from Hong Kong's done that a number of times recently. He and his elected members, who cover all of the building, fire professions, neighbourhood groups, publicly debate the design of buildings, their environmental consequences, how they put together, how people might use the apartment space, how the offices might work, etc. Those meetings are public. They advise the City Council based on that discussion. And that strikes me that that's actually the kind of issue that should be the focus of that kind of work. It's not to say that there's a one policy which should fit everything. It's to say that actually we need to think about what kinds of buildings we want to create in certain locations and have a robust kind of mechanism to assess those and not be shy about saying if something's not right, it shouldn't go ahead.
Is CAPE that mechanism in the UK?
It used to be.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, there's a big debate over how that should evolve, which is perhaps a topic for another event. But I wanted to pick up on the vitality deficit of tall buildings, and I've been trying to remember the vertical favela in somewhere in Venezuela. Yeah, outdated, where the first 22 stories approximately of this 40-story banking tower, which was never completed, has now been occupied by people who have nowhere else to live. There's no lifts, there's no power, and yet they're living quite a remarkable life, and they set up shops, schools and so on, businesses, using the stairs, and seeing people carrying fridges and cases of bottled water up and down those stairs was quite spectacular. But there was a remarkable community growing out of it. Now, I'm not proposing that is how we ought to use tall buildings generally, but it may be that if we did move away from these highly serviced, very tall buildings, that you could actually establish some kind of vertical community. But it wouldn't be in 100-story buildings, it wouldn't be in 50-story buildings. You might just get away with it in a 20-story building, but you'd have to have some very determined and fit people to build.
Sorry, just ask that. I mean, we're now on the 5th floor of this building. How many people took the stairs here? And the difference in getting into a lift and going up 20 stories, the difference in getting into a lift and going up 5, is actually very, very little. The impact of the way in which your life functions is not that different.
You're obviously not fit
No, you can feel it differently. Because what I was getting out of what Steve was saying is that it's not the verticality of the circulation, it's the speed and the connectivity. So if you take the stairs, you have a stop at each level, and crossings are possible, and the speed. What I'm seeing is that it's not the vertical circulation that's the problem in itself. Is the fact that you don't have connectivity. If you go to the 25th floor and you don't stop in between, then, which is the case now in most lifts because you program which solution rather than as a problem.
Okay, well, no one here except maybe Guy would consider this a tall building. And yet we've all taken the elevator straight to the top, so there is no...
That's
That's
so
not
nice.
That's a very interesting point.
And we
I
were
don't-
told to.
I don't know where the stairs are.
Yeah.
And maybe one of the things in taller buildings, if the stairs were more obvious,
Yeah.
then, and it wasn't just a fire
And
escape
make it
tucked around the back,
space.
then maybe people would, if they were moving between the 50th and the 54th floor, they might take the stairs
Yeah.
rather than the lift when once they've got up to their floor. So there may be a way of making of adding greater urban quality, the sort of things that we're interested in.
So,
On a vertical basis, but not the way the buildings are designed at the moment.
Can I finish on
yeah, on
the solutions that you... So I just want to mention two examples that I think could answer your question in terms of making tall buildings more livable as well. So I've got one example in Beijing, which is the Skivenall buildings, where they've got those kind of streets, horizontal bridges linking towers. And I was very skeptical about it, so I went there thinking this is never going to work. Actually, it doesn't work. They're high in the sky. There can't be any vibrancy. But just because of the density and the critical mass that those buildings have, which can be a problem if you push all of that into a public space, well, it actually works because of that critical mass. And then the second example, which is a lot less recent, which is Le Corbusier Cité Radieuse in Marseille, which I've been to recently because my sister lives there. And it hasn't worked for many years, and now it works. And they've got a conference room, they've got a school there, they've got a hotel, a cafe, and it actually works. So, and again, it's recreating that horizontal street in a building.
Is what you're saying kind of about culture, isn't it? Because our culture is not to live in high-rise. Actually, many of our cities are medium, I would say medium-rise, which is kind of 4 to 8 stories.
I don't know if it's culture, because one is in Beijing and one is in France, so it's two completely different cultures.
And there's the example that...
And Torres is in South America, so it's three different, very different places on Earth where you can actually start making something else into a movie.
okay, I have more questions to ask, but I'm going to put them on hold. Simon, you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
And then there's another question here, and then there.
Just picking up on these discussions about moving kind of public space up and putting kind of streets in the sky and parks on top of buildings. I mean, there's a kind of historical, a plethora of precedents. Sorry, we had Park Hill and Sheffield comes to mind, streets in the sky ideas. We had the pedways in London, fantastic documentary on that there is, where the first stories of all of the new buildings in the City of London were kind of left empty for people to kind of travel above the cars on these kind of great grounds as new kind of futuristic utopian images. But I mean, they didn't work, and people generally tend to take the path of least resistance. We're like water kind of running down hills. So I wonder, I mean, as on your slides, you had the enormous kind of hotel complex or tower complex with the beach or something on top. I can't remember where it is.
Singapore is a very unique example because they have no space. I wouldn't agree with putting walkways in here, there and everywhere, and as you say, they don't tend to work. And there are many examples of them not working. But in a city as congested as that, as starved for outdoor space, creating like that is potentially not bad.
I would nuance that statement. I think Singapore has space, and that garden is, half of it is a hotel pool, the other half is a nightclub. And that's it. And then there's a viewing observatory, and that's it. And most of them tend to get that. So I would nuance that statement.
I
kind of go back to my culture point, which is places like Park Hill, the Crescent in Manchester, which I launched years ago. Actually, as buildings, they don't necessarily not work, but they were managed very badly. In fact, they weren't managed at all. And I would suggest part of the reason they failed was because of the lack of management. We don't have that continental European tradition of having building managers, people on the ground, people to let, you know. And I think that's part of the reason why they failed. I'm funny enough taking students to Sheffield always to go and see Urban Splashes renovate Park Hill, so I should let you know what I think.
But the difference with Park Hill is that the circulation is horizontal, not vertical. It's a tall building, but it's connected to the land at both ends, so you can get horizontal access from grade to I think every flat in the scheme. So it's an interesting example of using topography, build tall to get the density, but retain that street level activity. It didn't work partly because it was never realised in the way that it should have been. It was quite successful for a while, and delivery vehicles did use the streets in design. It was people did spend time promenade.
Okay, another question here?
I suppose this is a sort of policy question. Are insects more important than people? Basically, we've got initially cities go very well, and closeness actually helps. So cities drive the economic cycle very well. So the bigger the place, the lower the unemployment during economic downturn. So we know that they work. The issue for London at present, as our major wealth creator is the UK, which we should be concerned about, is it doesn't inform the person who say on the platform that it does need those very quickly. And in fact, 2 years in most schools, it needs 200,000 places in schools in London in 2 years. And the schools aren't able to do that. So London's got this amazing problem. So for me, I'm going to go up, but let's think about what else is going on with government policy. One of the things we had is the bedroom tax, which is all about the fact that we've got more actual spaces in houses than we're using, and we're just moving more people around. Now, in London's particular case, there's a quite interesting issue to do with who's occupying the spaces, who's living in the places. And talk endlessly about that, but let's just look at the figures. Say 20% of the population in London lives in households which are not working. And the big thing London needs is places for people to work. So should we build the brick up, build the insects, and look after the people, or should we move people out and have the workers in?
Well, I think the first thing we should do is be converting office space into residential. But I think that there are arguments for building out rather than up. I wouldn't necessarily say you can't build up anywhere. But I go back to my point about capacity. You need to think about what is a reasonable, a sustainable capacity for a city in any particular location, in any particular circumstance, at any particular level in the hierarchy of its hinterland. We've got to take. There's a view about how much housing London needs, but we ought to take a view as to how much housing London can accommodate. And if we came to the conclusion that it can't accommodate it sustainably, then we need to find somewhere else. And it's predict and provide approach. We grew out of that in relation to traffic a long time ago, and maybe we need to take a more end-like approach to population growth as well.
I think actually I entirely agree with Steve, but with my northern head on, I think this is kind of a problem with regional policy really. I know this is kind of slightly straying off the topic, but in the absence of, it was until very recently into the Labour government that we had a redistributive regional policy. It was the Labour government who abolished it. And I suggest that as part of this kind of constitutional discussion that's taking place, we should think about that. Cities like Newcastle, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham are all booming and have been booming this last year or so. There's a lot of activity going on. Often those cities, not exclusively, but all of them, even Liverpool, have very good public transport, have a large amount of brownfield land. They could absorb a lot of the pressure from the southeast that would require good public transport. and might actually relieve a lot of the pressure to build tall. I do believe that tall buildings can provide a solution in the right location, and I think that's the point we need to make. But I agree, my point is kind of to support Steve in saying that we should think about redistributing that pressure to places that can absorb it.
Okay, so there was one final question on this front row, and then we'll get to you.
Sorry, I can talk loud, it's fine. Yeah, I find microphones very disconcerting anyway. It's really nice to hear that the provinces are getting a look in, and that kind of leads into my first question, which is about, could you kind of be more specific about what constitutes a tall building? Because I've recently been living in Sheffield. We've already kind of touched upon it a couple of times. Park Hill, 13 stories tall, at its tallest point. To me, that is a tall building, but in London, that probably isn't. And it's also kind of been touched upon in the kind of contemporary UK context that sort of form follows finance in respect to kind of building tall. And I suppose, in a sense, London's quite blessed in the sense that at the moment, it's kind of quite good at developing a mixture of tenures for different sort of different types of lifestyles, so kind of have young people, young single people, but also kind of families in an urban environment. I would say that outside of London, that is kind of designers are not as successful at doing that, and that is partly due to this kind of form follows finance idea, where actually it's the kind of yuppie silos that inevitably end up being tall buildings. And I suppose my question is about how can we encourage, as sort of designers and urbanists, the kind of proliferation of those kind of more sort of model schemes outside of just the capital.
Do you have an example of a model scheme?
No, I try not to look at contemporary architecture because it just makes me upset.
No, okay. Just in my mind, we're not doing very well in London, and we're not building for a mixture of people.
I mean, I probably actually jump back to many of the kind of projects from the welfare state in my mind's eyes.
Okay, so
I come from the kind of an architectural sort of background, I suppose. So my mind jumps to those who's kind of like that tailored aim to the sort of house building rather than just the financial aim of much so much development today.
So firstly, I completely agree. Well, there are various different definitions for what a tall building is, and different government structures adopt different sides of it. I completely agree with you, and my favourite is that a tall building is anything that significantly stands out from what's around it. Other places like will be more prescriptive in terms of meterage or stories or whatever it may be. In terms of a mix of tenure, I know you're talking more in kind of in terms of a family sense, but I'd like to kind of draw the attention to the growth of the PRS sector in London and will be throughout the UK. And actually that may be a solution to the issues that we have in terms of affordability within I guess I'm thinking primarily in this city. And actually the ability for landlords and developers to build a product that is different from what we've seen previously, and that has been designed differently, designed to be lived in differently, for all, I guess, for all types of people, for all, whether you're a single or a family or a couple, or and the range of extra sort of opportunities that brings to not just policymakers but to developers and to individuals. And I think that it has the ability to slightly change the way in which we think about the way in which we use our buildings and our neighbourhoods.
I think there's, you hit on a really important point, and I pointed at the outset to some of the reasons why we built tall buildings. One of the things that I did emphasise was that virtually all of the tall public housing that's been listed so far has been public housing, and that has virtually disappeared. And I think Park Hill was a terrific example of a visionary approach by a confident local authority. I think Biker similarly was commissioned by a local authority. remarkable. And my favourite is the Barbican estate, which was successful when it was built. It's now virtually entirely private, but it remains successful both in terms of the accommodation it provides and the public realm and public activities that surround it. So it can be done. It can be done perhaps by a great public patronage. And maybe the debate that's been happening over the last week or so since the referendum in Scotland about giving greater powers to cities and city regions is one of the ways in which we might find a new way of investing in public amenities and public housing. I'm not saying that you wouldn't blend that with the public rented sector, private rented sector as well. And it may well be that the trend towards pension funds beginning to invest in housing may give us a further way of refreshing this idea of public housing, of social housing as being for the public good and something that we as communities see as something sensible to invest in.
Yes, and then we're going to...
Yeah, I think the issue that you talk about is in the northern city is very interesting. Some work I did, it's a few years old now, from 2007, basically suggested that something like 90% of all of the new tall buildings outside London are mixed use, but not particularly in a good way. Private housing, high-end hotels, a couple of Swiss restaurants, all of them. There's a real lack of any debate around the ability of high-density tall buildings to provide social housing, for example. So I think it's a really important issue. It'll be interesting what happens. None are under construction at the moment, I'm aware of. Certainly in Manchester.
Okay, yes,
Well, and that is actually the point I wanted to make, because high buildings work really, really well with very homogenous groups of people who can afford the higher service costs. But when you want genuinely affordable housing that doesn't require a service charge, not only for the lift, the concierge, but also maintaining the estate, the privately maintained estate around it, then actually you have to look to high density mid-rise. And the problem that we've got at the moment in London is that housing that we're building now doesn't meet a lot of the need that we have for genuinely affordable housing. If I can just rise to that point about London needing 200,000 school places, I was told last week that half the school places in Westminster are currently vacant. London is hollowing out. Poorer people can no longer afford to live here, and most of them are in employment, but they're in poorly paid employment that doesn't enable them to meet the high rent costs, the high service costs. So if we want to genuinely have a vibrant city that meets the needs of all, we need a variety of different housing types, and high-rise certainly can't meet all of those.
That's a great point. Yes, of course.
I think that point you make about hollowing out is really important. Certainly those of us who are observing the impact of globalisation on cities in academia are really concerned about this. You can look to Paris, Manhattan and New York and see the spatial implications of what's happening, and exactly the same thing is happening in London. The diversity of the city, be that from a kind of social cohesion perspective, is going. People are being pushed to the periphery, and their ability, actually, you probably read it, there's a really interesting article in The Guardian yesterday or the day before, talking about the ability, the potential for there to be riots amongst people who, in poorly paid jobs, who are forced to live on the edge of the city, who have to travel in, but there is no capacity on the public transport network to get them in on time to service the elite. And it's a huge, I just wanted to endorse that point. I think it's really a point of real concern for us.
Any final questions? Yes.
Thank you. It was really interesting. Heard a lot of different things, and that's kind of what made me think that we started off talking about livability. And each speaker has taken a different slant on what livability is and interpreted urbanism in a different way. And it said a lot about the way that cities are embodying many different important things. But I was wondering if each of you could maybe sum up what to you is the single most important part of livability. And that's probably quite annoying.
No, that's great, but you know, we're going to be doing closing statements from everyone, so maybe we could integrate that into the closing statement. So as well as kind of a summary of your argument, you could say what you think of as livability, and maybe what you think of as a tall building, because that was your question as well. Do you know what time? Okay. Well, oh, sorry. Yes, Guy.
I was just going to say, first of all, Laura made a point about exclusivity for tall buildings, and where I was brought up in South Wales, tall buildings were a sign of poverty, and nobody wanted to live in tall buildings. And in Cardiff was regenerated, and they couldn't let the flats because there was a stigma to do with tall buildings. That was just a side point. But coming to where I spent most of my career in Liverpool, I think the market is a driver here, rather than, I think the market drives livable tall buildings, not so much tall buildings in themselves. Because what happened there was Beetham, who did Manchester and Liverpool, 2 towers in Liverpool and 1 in Manchester, and then didn't actually get to do the one in London. If the market had carried on going, I think there would be livable tall buildings. But what's happened became ghettos to a certain extent, with drug problems, gun problems, because the tenants or the investors bought them, couldn't find tenants, prices went down, and they became effectively executive ghettos. And I think that if the market had carried on going, the aspirational view of living there and creating a community in livable cities would have spiralled and it would have continued, but the market curtailed the success of tall buildings in northern cities. And so there are quite a few failed tall buildings. Actually, I can't think of any livable tall buildings in Liverpool. Our building on the waterfront was reduced in height, which would have made it a viable tall building, and we worked very hard to make it a livable building. But long-term management and long-term involvement by the developer helps that, but all the developers of the unsuccessful buildings went to disappear like dust. So I think the market is an important factor in the success of livable tall buildings.
I think there was a question from Pat.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think there have been some very interesting points made about why we failed in the UK and why actually other cities, rather than really pretty livable, Vancouver obviously is the great example we all love. But what I would hope to get out of this evening is some thoughts on, given that we are going to have tall buildings, what are the most important things that we get right? Because the lessons of failure are as important as the lessons of success. And I think what's very interesting is that in this country we either build them through public sector, local authority housing, and they may have been perfectly good buildings. I'm certainly thrilled that Park Hill is coming alive again, and there are other examples, but they were local authority examples, publicly funded, for purely social housing. And now we're seeing privately funded examples, which when we're talking about mixed-use residential, we are talking about privately owned because, as Janet said, housing associations would dream of taking space in them because they couldn't afford the service charges. But the public benefit is going into transport or schools or public spaces like the linear park. I promise you, Steve, it's not a battle for supremacy at Vauxhall. I think Michael had a key point. The key to this is governance, and there are plans in London, and there have been, for where the tall buildings should be in London, and why there are transport interchanges. The sight lines at Vauxhall are absolutely about World Heritage sight lines in the North Tower. But what we need to do is get the groundscape right, and that's, for me, much more important than the skyline, frankly, because we'll get a cluster. But at the ground, it's got to be something that people want to be part of. And I would hope that whichever side of the debate we're on, we recognise that actually we've only got some of the regeneration in some of the areas because we've got international investment. I can't really see why that should only go in the city. I can't see why residents of London and Wandsworth shouldn't have it as well. And there are other places. But there are probably places where it's not right. And I can't myself see how a Skyline Commission is going to bring together great and good people who are better than people who are already making judgments, whether it's in local authorities or in Cade, which is not there, but with English heritage is about to produce more tall buildings guidance. What I would really like to see in the debate is what people think is the most important thing to be in that guidance, to make sure that not only are we planning right, but we're getting right. Because unfortunately, all of the examples Steve gave of great public tall buildings or social housing, which decline because the management isn't right, not because the building isn't right, and which have lived again because they become private buildings where there's the investment put into them. As we go forward, I think it's accessibility a really difficult game to play, and I think you need everybody's expertise to work out how you get that game right.
Thank you. So I think this ties neatly in with the closing statements, because that question was essentially what is the most important things we get right in tall buildings. And so if you could each hopefully say something about that and what sort of livability means in your perspective, and summarise your argument, that would be great. We'll go... why don't we follow the speaking order? So Ed first, yes.
Great. Well, I'll start off with my definition of livability. I think it's got a lot to do with your ability to access the services, goods, and people that you want to be able to access, and the environment in which you're able to do that. Providing you have the space and the availability and the access to what you want to. Having tall buildings doesn't have to restrict that, and in fact, in many ways, can create the space around those buildings at the ground scale, as the lady at the back was discussing. And I think, actually going through into that, the groundscape would be, for me, the most important thing, because I do think that we exist in a horizontal plane. And I'll go back to my discussion about the elevators, that I don't necessarily have a problem with living at a high altitude, because if I can then be on the ground in a very short period of time, into a pleasant groundscape, which has all the services and amenities that I'm wanting, that I'm looking for, I feel that that's far, far better than really what the alternatives seem to be, which are I live a very long way away and I have to commute in to see the people and the places that I want to see. Or we have a kind of what I see as a slightly mismatched mid-rise scheme that would potentially work if it was created that way, but to overlay that onto a historic fine-grained city, I don't believe has a virtue. I'd just like to touch also on, I think that largely we may all be in some sort of agreement in that actually tall buildings can contribute to creating living places, but it's very difficult. That's not to say that they can't at all. So as a result, I think we should all be voting for them.
Thank you. Laura?
In terms of defining what livability is, I think Ed is kind of spot on. It's having the freedom to access open space, to have a decent amount of space where you live, to be able to meet other people from different backgrounds very easily, to have a variety of experiences right on your doorstep, which right now tall buildings are not necessarily good at yet. And so how we should make them work harder at doing that is, I mean, we've mentioned a few ideas. One is slow down the pace of circulation, create that possibility of interacting with others in the same building, creating the mixity, be it in terms of tenants or in terms of users, and then obviously maintaining or enabling services that make the tall building possible happen, and that means enabling that maybe via a financial model or via a policy framework for that to happen for public tall buildings as well as private tall buildings, and even maybe hybrid public-private tall buildings. So that would be my conclusion. And for me, it's all three things. It's a financial model that supports that, the policy framework, and design. It's all three things.
Brilliant. Okay. Michael.
Okay, I've got a relatively simple answer to the livability question. It's not simplistic, which is that for me, and it kind of augments what the other guys have said, is livability is about the street. And actually, I'd add to what you said, I'm sure you intended this, but actually it's about the street for pedestrians and cyclists. It's not about the street for people in their 4x4s in North London. And I think that's, I don't want to diminish, it's a bit of a trite point, but it's very important. We need to create streets that work for people who walk out their front door, or walk out of the tube station, or get off the bus. And that, for me, is the quintessential nature of livability. I think the question about what we need to do in London, in addition to what's taken place, is a really interesting one. I wouldn't want to have given the impression that I don't think the planning strategy itself is robust. I think the plans, the planning framework, the London plan, local authority plans, and the various guidance documents are actually all very good as documents themselves. There's something about the implementation of them which kind of is where my governance point came from. There's something going wrong. And I was thinking, as you were asking that, making that point about what we could do additionally, and I was thinking about the good examples that were in my head. And in all of those instances, they have what we have, but they have something additional, which is, I suppose, I don't know whether this is the right word, but some sort of design coding. Certainly North American system works very differently to here, so I'm not suggesting we do exactly the same. But actually, if you imagine the London plan has allocated a node for tall buildings in South London, for example, great. What happens then? We need more than that. We need some sort of code which indicates what an appropriate height is, what the mixture of uses should be, how the towers themselves will hit the ground, what the cumulative impact of those towers, however many there may be in that node, will be. How will people use it? How will people permeate the space? How will it lead to legibility? What will be the impact kind of at a metropolitan level on the skyline, on historic monuments? It's that extra step that we need to go. And I can imagine that would be quite unpopular because it might be seen as an extra layer of regulation, but actually you could conceive of that through my own eyes as being allowing a much greater degree of certainty to a developer. And I think that's probably what we have to do. So I've written down my closing statement. So I urge you to support the motion that tall buildings can contribute to creating livable places. An acceptance of tall buildings must, however, so there's a caveat, be based on an understanding of place, really important. It must recognise but also augment that character and the distinctiveness. It should attract consensus, and I actually mean consensus, and be of high quality. Thank you.
Okay, and finally, Steve.
There are three reasons why I think you should oppose the motion. They are environmental, cultural, and visual. And it's based on the experience that we have of tall buildings so far in this country, in this city in particular, in this country and around the world. I've talked about capacity, and I think that allowing the market to decide where tall buildings should go will lead us to increasing accommodation beyond that which can be sustained by the city and its surrounding supporting area. The market will always provide additional accommodation. It's just if it get more expensive, the more highly serviced it has to be. So I think that we should first establish much more carefully what the capacity of a city is, what the capacity of different parts of it are, and what density should come from that. And then have a discussion about how that density should be accommodated within buildings of different types. The second point is cultural. I said that tall buildings are isolating and exclusive, and however mixed the uses are, and Ed mentioned that, but Mike also pointed out that the mix of uses isn't that mixed. But they are isolating in terms of people living away from, in isolated locations away from each other. They tend to be monocultural, and they tend to be, as I said, because they're expensive buildings, they tend to be occupied by a limited sector of the population. And the third reason is that because they're tall, they have a huge impact on the skyline and our visual perception of the cities that we live in. The impact of the ability to design and construct just about any shape or just about any material has led to a zoo of interesting shapes, perhaps, in London, and Pudong in Shanghai is perhaps the classic example of novelty architecture. And I think that, if London could have the skyline of Chicago, I might be more comfortable. But the tendency towards novelty and variety, I think, has a detrimental impact on the quality of our city skyline.
Thank you. So, Simon, do you think we should do a bit of a show of hands for and against the motion? Okay, so the title of the event, I realise now, is quite vague and gentle. But if we sort of rephrase it as do tall buildings create livable places, who is for? Okay. And against? And don't know? Or undecided? Okay, so the motion has passed. Tall buildings do create livable